Thanks for joining me today. My name is Sean Egglestone and I'm a registered dietitian in the state of Oregon, and today I'm going to be giving my presentation about blue zones. So what are blue zones? Blue zones are 5 areas around the world that scientists have identified where people tend to live the longest. Typically in these areas, they have high concentration of people living to be 100 or older. Where does that term blue zone come from? The name or the term blue zone comes from demographic maps. So here in this photo of the US, we look at cardiovascular disease mortality rates in different states, and you'll see that it goes from blue to red, meaning blue is the lowest concentration of cardiovascular disease deaths, and the red is the highest per capita. And you'll see there's a high concentration in the southeast. But in the middle of the map, you'll see this dark blue area. That's actually Denver, Colorado. They have very low rates of heart disease. Some interesting facts about blue zones. People in the blue zones typically live to be 100 or older, and that exceeds the average life expectancy of average Americans by almost 25 years. In Okinawa, Japan, they have the longest disability-free life expectancy in the world. It's not just about the longevity or the years in which one lives, but also the quality of those years. And we find that these people eat 3 to 4 times the amount of vegetables as the average American. They call this island Land of the Immortals. Icaria, Greece has the highest percentage of 90-year-olds. 1 in 3 people are over the age of 90. Dementia is rare. They have 50% lower risk of heart disease compared to the US, and it's often said that this is the island where people forget to die. Sardinia, Italy was the first blue zone discovered, and these people that live here have the longest life expectancy in the world. In Nicoya, Costa Rica, the middle-aged residents have a much higher chance of reaching 90 years of age than U.S. citizens. And then Loma, California. This is the average life expectancy of 89, which is over 10 years longer than the average American. And here we have a high concentration of Seventh-day Adventists, which are primarily vegetarian vegan. If you see down here on the right-hand side, that's the Blue Zone book written by Dan Buettner. And this presentation is basically an excerpt of this book. It will talk a lot about the different facts that are presented in this book. And if you want to explore this topic deeper, I highly recommend you pick a copy up at your local library. When we study these 5 blue zone areas, what do they have in common? What can we summarize from these areas that might help us understand why they live so long and so healthy, and how can we do the same for ourselves? The first is they know their purpose. Many of these people have jobs that involve farming, gardening, shepherding. They don't have a 9-to-5 job where they go to the office. This is not, they don't have a high performance, or they're not CEOs, they're not managing businesses. These are very, very simple lifestyles, if you will. And it's that lifestyle and providing for their family that gives them purpose. Oftentimes these areas have low stress levels. They say in Icaria, Greece, that if you have someone over for lunch, they could show up anywhere between noon and sundown. So they often don't have watches. They don't live by the clock. They have very, very low stress levels, and part of that is also because they like to nap. Number 3 is the 80% rule, and this is taken from Okinawa, Japan. The folks there eat until they're 80% full. So they don't eat until they're stuffed. They don't eat until they just can't have another bite. They eat until they don't have hunger anymore. Number 4 is social networking. So we find that there's a strong sense of community involvement. Oftentimes these people will volunteer, they'll go to the market, or they have local groups and friends that they meet up with for tea, and there's a strong sense of rapport that they have with the community. Local towns, the people have such a high regard for these centenarians, these people that are living so long and healthy. Number 5 is they drink wine, 1 to 2 drinks daily. Number 6 is they have a sense of belonging, and it's not just religious. Now, often these areas do have religious affiliations. However, research has shown that even if you're not religious, but you attend religious ceremonies, whether it's Sunday service or Mass, or you attend them with friends or family, that there's still a benefit to that. Number 7 is family first, and not just putting their family first or being at the center of their family, but they also have intergenerational families. And what that means is you have great-great-grandparents living with their children, their children's children, their children's children's children, because when you get to be this old, you definitely have a lot of grandkids. And they often marry for life, and so there's a strong commitment with their family and keeping everyone close by. These aren't folks that go to nursing homes or they go to other long-term care facilities. These centenarians stay with their families. Number 8 is they move naturally. These aren't people that go to the gym, they don't work out, they don't run marathons, they don't lift weights. They create a lifestyle that supports natural movement and natural exercise. And by doing that, it's not something that they have to plan into their day. It's just a part of their day. And it's that low to moderate activity level consistently on a daily basis for a long term that really improves their life expectancy. And number 9, and this is really what this presentation is going to focus on, is they all have a whole food plant-centered diet. Now, these 5 areas, none of them are exclusively vegan, but we do find that their meat consumption is often very, very low, but at the center of their diet, the center is plants, 75, 85% whole plant foods, and it's supplemented with animal products. So the first location on our trip today is going to be Okinawa, Japan. This is the land of the immortals. What we see from this pie chart is that the majority of their calories come from sweet potatoes. What we find is that when you look at the geography and the weather on the island, is it's really not conducive to growing rice. And through trade routes developed many centuries ago, the sweet potato made its way over to Okinawa, Japan, and became a staple food because it's so easily grown there. It's very high in antioxidants and other vitamins and minerals. The people here often have gardens. They grow herbs and spices such as turmeric, ginger, and mugwort. So gardening not only provides a source of stress reduction and activity level, but they're also growing their food as well. In Okinawa, Japan, they consume a lot of soy. And that's really important because soy not only is high in flavonoids, but also high in phytoestrogen. Now, many people believe that soy increases their estrogen exposure or could increase their risk of breast cancer. But what we find is that fermented soy, such as tofu, actually lowers our risk of breast cancer. And for those that have had breast cancer, it lowers their risk of getting it again. And the reason for that is because soy contains a plant-based estrogen, which is different than an animal estrogen that you would get from dairy products or from eating meat. When we have estrogen from animal products, it binds to our estrogen receptors and activates it just like our own estrogen would. But when we have estrogen from plant products such as soy, it binds to those receptors and blocks our exposure to estrogen without activating those receptors, and so it lowers our exposure to estrogen. These people are vegetarian by circumstance, just based on the conditions of the island has really driven their diet towards where it is now. They get a lot of sunshine because they're outside, so vitamin D is great for good bone health. They stay active, So not only are they gardening for activity, but they also have very minimal furniture. And this is important because they're standing and sitting 30 plus times a day. It's a great source of activity for them that's low impact. This diet, if you add up the different pieces of the chart, you'll notice that it's 94% whole plant foods, 76% vegetables. These folks are 8 times less likely to die from heart disease. They're independent until such a late age in life, 97. They have lower risks of things like prostate, breast, and colon cancer. So it's not just about the heart disease. A healthy diet reduces your risk for all kinds of chronic illnesses. They maintain their weight throughout life. One interesting quote from this book, it says, heart disease is a process, not an event, and so prevention needs to be thought of the same way. These are just some quick photos of some meals that they might consume. You'll see a lot of vegetables, a lot of sea vegetables, sweet potatoes obviously being the majority of their calories, and some noodles. Icaria, Greece. This is the island where people forget to die. They don't check their watches. They run on their own clock. Now, these folks consume what many would consider to be a Mediterranean diet. It is worth pointing out that along the Mediterranean, there's over 20 different countries. There really is no consistent definition of a Mediterranean diet because different countries follow different dietary patterns. And you'll find when we talk about Sardinia, Italy, that their dietary pattern is very different from Greece, despite them also being in the Mediterranean. But this is what is traditionally taught of as a Mediterranean diet. It's centered around fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains, with a little bit of fish and olive oil. The fruits and vegetables make up over 60% of their diet. They have meat 5 times a month. They have fish twice a week. These folks are not eating meat every day. Meat is a treat, and you'll see that across all of these areas. These aren't wealthy people. They're not well off, and meat is very, very expensive. You have to store it, and oftentimes they're butchering, they're growing and butchering, raising their own meat. They're not going to the store necessarily and buying it. They go to markets to get meat, so it's a treat. It's not a daily or an every meal kind of thing. Just like in Okinawa, Japan, they grow their own herbs. Here they have rosemary, sage, oregano. These are very high in antioxidants. They focused on unheated oils. About 3.5 tablespoons per day is what I averaged out for 6% of their calories. They nap very frequently. What we find is that people that nap occasionally have a 12% lower risk of dying from a heart attack, and those that nap on a daily basis have a 35% lower risk of dying from a heart attack. Family and friends are a priority, so this is where that the social events, that social interaction, and that putting family first, that's where this comes in, right here. They're very, very family and friend centered. They have 79% whole plant food diet, and their terrain is very rugged, and so when they walk around, when they go to friends' houses, when they commute, they're doing so by foot, and they're climbing up and down, and so it's like doing a stair stepper is how they sort of related the type of activity that they would do on a daily basis. 1 in 3 people live to at least 90 years old. They have very low rates of dementia, 20% less cancer risk, half of the heart disease risk. They have a third of the depression as we see in the U.S. And they consume 6 times as many beans as we do here in the U.S. They have 6 cups of coffee a day. They consume about a quarter of the amount of added sugar, and they drink about 2 to 4 glasses of wine a day. This slide here just has some photos of what would traditionally be thought of as a Mediterranean diet. So it's centered around beans, vegetables. They have some cilantro, some herbs in there. They have some grapes, some wine. So a really plant-centered diet. In Sardinia, Italy, this is where the longest living people in the world are. This is the first blue zone that was ever discovered. you'll notice that their vegetable consumption is less than what we saw in Greece. They consume more dairy, they consume more whole grains. So the fruits and the vegetables actually make up a much smaller portion of the diet. Very interestingly, we find that the longest living people in Sardinia actually lived closer to the middle of the island because this island has been occupied many, many times over the centuries by different ruling empires, and so as people retreated to the hills inland, not only did they get more exercise, but they also had less exposure to other dietary patterns as well as other genetic factors. And so this has really fostered an environment for longevity. They focus on whole grains. They're not having white flour, white sugar. They're consuming whole, unrefined grains. 12% of their calories come from vegetables, which is about 1 to 2 pounds daily. The cheese that they consume is from sheep. So not only are they shepherds getting exercise that way, but there's a higher omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio based on the grass-fed sheep. Meat is reserved for Sunday. So again, they're not eating meat every single day, twice a day. Very, very low meat consumption across all 5 groups that we're talking about. They walk as exercise. Some they say would walk as much as 6 to 10 miles a day. They enjoy wine. They have a whole plant-centered diet. And there's 10 times more centenarians than the U.S. per capita. And they have a high quality of life as they age. One very interesting fact here is that the men tend to live longer than the women. And they think it's because the men live less stressful lives. Oftentimes they say the women wear the pants in the relationship. They have the financial burdens, they have some of the stress from home life, and men tend to carry less stress than the women, and so they think maybe that could contribute to their higher average age. These are just some basic photos that I put together. Here's the Cantonau grapes. Those are those grapes I mentioned. That Sardinia sun is very, very strong, and so these grapes are very, very high in antioxidants, and oftentimes when they make the wine, they use the skins and everything, so this wine is very, very good for them. They also consume, like I mentioned, that sheep cheese that's higher in omega-3s and lower in omega-6s. They have a grain-based diet, and the meat is very, very infrequent. Nicoya, Costa Rica, where men live longer than the women. This is a very interesting area because their dietary pattern, I would say, is in many ways less healthy than any of the other dietary patterns. They have a high amount of their calories coming from dairy, and they actually have more added sugar. But what we do see with their diet is they have the squash, the corns, and the beans. This is what we call the Three Sisters. And the Three Sisters helps raise their HDL, their good cholesterol, and lower their bad cholesterol, their LDL. They eat a light dinner. If you were to drink about 1.5 gallons of water from Nicoya, Costa Rica, you would consume about 1 gram of calcium. So very, very high calcium content, which is what they think contributes to their strong bones. They get a lot of vitamin D from the sun. They have 56% whole plant foods. We've seen 70, 80, 90% whole plant foods. Here they're only having 56% whole plant foods, but it's still much better than the average American. They eat fewer calories, which we think slows the aging process. And the more calories we consume, it increases metabolic byproducts. And so we think that by consuming fewer calories, it helps us live a little bit longer. And so they also have very low rates of dementia, much, much lower than the US. They consume meat 1 to 2 times a week. And they have 23% lower risk of cancer compared to other areas in Costa Rica. These are just some examples. Here we see the Three Sisters, that corn, the rice, the beans, they do the tortillas. They interviewed one person who recalled that if they wanted salt or sugar, they had to walk 18 miles and back to the local market to get that. So they just don't have the same access to the unhealthy junk food that we have here in the U.S. Now, this is the last area that we're going to be talking about today. This is Loma Linda, California. So here in Loma Linda, California, there's a high concentration of Seventh-day Adventists. They're very strict vegetarians, and oftentimes they're vegan, meaning they don't consume any animal products at all. So no meat, cheese, dairy, eggs. But many of the Seventh-day Adventists, based on my research, is they usually follow what we would consider a vegetarian diet. So they have some dairy, but their diet is still centered around, see that high concentration of vegetables, fruits. So it's 81% whole plant foods compared to 56 in Costa Rica. They have beans. They say that their quarter cup of mixed nuts and seeds every day could contribute at least a few years of added life. They eat meat sparingly, if at all. They don't have a lot of sugar, salt, refined grains. There's no caffeine, there's no smoking, there's no alcohol. Even though they're living in an environment with a high level of air pollution and other stressors, we find that their diet is likely contributing to their high longevity. These are just some random examples of vegetarian and vegan food. Here we have some sweet potato lasagna on the bottom. We've got some hummus and vegetables and meatless tacos. So now that we've covered 5 different blue zones, we've learned that it's a plant-centered diet. They have a lot of nuts and seeds, a lot of beans, much more vegetables, real healthy lifestyle that supports and surrounds that. So let's take a look at what are we doing here in America. We're getting the majority of our calories from processed foods such as chips, crackers, cookies, snack foods, all that stuff in the aisles. Food that doesn't actually resemble the whole plant foods that it came from. And oftentimes these processed foods have added sugar, salt, oils, and fats that make them even more unhealthy for us. We have a high intake of meat, dairy, and eggs. Our meat consumption is much greater than what we've seen across the blue zones. And the smallest portion of our diet, not the largest, but the smallest, is our fruits, our vegetables, our whole plant foods, and very little variety as well. Down here in the bottom right, you'll see the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2015 to 2020. If you head on over to my website, SeanTheRD.com, that's SeanTheRD.com, and you go over to recommended resources, you'll find a link, or you can just go to Google and type in Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2015 PDF, and it'll come up with some of the content that we will review right now. So what we see here is starchy vegetables and legumes, beans, peas, chickpeas, lentils. The blue bars are the recommended amounts that we should be consuming daily, and the dots are where we're at. And what we see is that starchy vegetable consumption, such as whole unprocessed corn and potatoes, we're low in. We're also low in beans, peas, chickpeas, and lentils, and that's across all age groups. So fruit and vegetable consumption. Remember, in these blue zones, the majority of their calories are coming from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and beans. And what we see here is that our fruit and vegetable consumption is basically inadequate across all age levels. Now, if you notice on the left-hand side, you'll see that they are meeting their fruit consumption, ages 1 to 8, and I believe that's because of their fruit juice consumption. It's the juice, the refined juice consumption, not whole plant foods, or whole fruit, I should say, so just keep that in mind. But we're definitely not having enough fruits, we're not having enough vegetables, so we're way below the recommended guidelines. Whole grain and sugar consumption. The orange dots is our average refined grain consumption, and the bars, that's the range of intake for whole grains, and then the green triangles are average whole grain consumption. So what we're seeing is we're consuming way too much refined grains, not enough whole grain. And the added sugar is just ridiculous, especially ages 4 to 30. So ages 4 to 30, our intake of added sugar is just way too much. Our meat consumption, we consume plenty of meat. If you head on over to the Harvard School of Public Health, they actually recommend no more than 1 to 2 glasses or servings per day of dairy products. And we do know that from a huge body of independent research that dairy intake is not associated with longevity. It's not associated with a lower risk of things like hip fractures. In the U.S., we have some of the highest rates of hip fractures, and we also have one of the highest intakes of calcium per capita. The diets of these centenarians are healthy despite their dairy intake, not because of it. So what should we actually eat? Well, on the right-hand side, these are cup equivalents per day. So here it has vegetables, it's got fruits, it's got grains, the nuts, the seeds, the soy products, the beans. That's really where our protein should come from if we're going to eat like a centenarian, not the seafood and the meat. Here it says 8-ounce equivalents per week. These folks are eating very, very little meat. And if you have a question as to, well, what's considered a cup equivalent, on the left-hand side here, so a half a cup of green beans is considered a half a cup equivalent. 1 cup of raw vegetables is half a cup equivalent. And it also has fruits, grains, and dairy. So it has a little chart that you can use to convert with. It's worth noting the physical activity guidelines. So what we see across all genders, across all ages, is that we're not getting enough aerobic and anaerobic activity during the day. And we see 30% meeting them ages 18 to 24, and it's basically just downhill from there. In these blue zones, these people aren't pumping iron, they're not running marathons, they didn't join the gym. They live in environments that constantly nudge them into moving without thinking about it. The current recommendations for activity levels are 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity weekly. That's considered brisk walking, dancing, gardening, housework, traditional hunting and gathering, whatever that means, or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity weekly, so running, walking, cycling, aerobics, fast swimming. If you want to work out 3 10-minute sessions or 1 30-minute session in a day, it has the same benefit. And then there's also recommendations for strength training, so aim to do a single set of an exercise for each body part using a weight or resistance level heavy enough to tire your muscles after 12 to 15 reps. Do strength training exercises for all major muscle groups at least 2 times a week. So let's recap. Physical activity is part of their lifestyle. It's unplanned. They maintain a healthy weight or BMI throughout their adult life. These populations do not smoke. They consume alcohol, some more than others, but they do so responsibly. Their meat, poultry, fish, and eggs are used as condiments, flavorings, but not a majority of their source of their calories that we see in the U.S. They have minimal added fat, sugar, refined grains, and processed foods. And I would say, after doing this presentation, that's one of the most surprising facts, if you will, is they have a decent amount of their calories coming from dairy products, but very little meat consumption and almost no processed foods. No processed foods. If they want something to eat, they need to cook it. There's no little box they can open and stick their hand in and grab a snack. They have high nutrient, low calorie foods. And we definitely see that in Okinawa, Japan. They consume 3 to 4 times the amount of food for the same calorie level. They're getting full on high fiber, high water foods, high nutrient value foods without all the calories. They focus on whole grains and beans, which are high in fiber. They lower our risk for not only heart disease, but things like colon cancer. And they have a whole food, plant-centered diet. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and their Center for Disease Control has said that 80% of heart disease and type 2 diabetes and 40% of cancers can be prevented through diet, physical activity, and not using tobacco. That is a huge number. 80% of heart disease, 80% of type 2 diabetes, and 40% of cancer can be prevented through not smoking or using tobacco, the physical activity guidelines that I mentioned in the prior slide, and following a diet that's a whole food, plant-centered diet with minimal processed foods, lower dairy, and lower meat consumption. And when you look at all the different reasons why people get disease, the majority of those reasons are diet related. Being the holidays right now, we can take this sweet potato dish with marshmallows and we can use baked sweet potatoes. And here they have them stuffed with things like raisins and cranberries, or we can go over and check out the Engine #2 cookbook by Rip Esselstyn, and we can make his famous sweet potato lasagna. Here in the top center, we have a sweet potato dish with beans. And so moving away from marshmallows, these centenarians aren't eating marshmallows. They're eating the sweet potatoes, but they're not processed. There's no added butter and sugar and marshmallows. They're combining them with other nutrient-dense foods. And if you head on over to the Blue Zone website, here I have a link down in the bottom. They have an awesome recipe page that will outline different squash recipes. Here we have an Embrasure salad. It doesn't really resemble anything. I'm not really sure what it even looks like. It just has a bunch of colorful marshmallows covered in mayonnaise. But what we want to see is a shift away from that and towards maybe like a Waldorf salad. Maybe it's made with Greek yogurt, and we have a very light coating of yogurt, but it's really centered around the fruits and the vegetables and the nuts and the seeds in that dish. Here we're taking a refined linguine and we're moving towards a whole wheat pasta. We're moving away from a dairy or a cream-based sauce, which is high in calories and saturated fat and cholesterol, and moving towards either a red sauce. You can do a little bit of basil pesto on it. Here we're featuring pork and beans, and the reason I have that is because I recently worked with a patient that was post-open heart, and he was telling me that he's eating pork and beans from a can. Not only is it high in sodium, but we know that processed meat increases our risk for things like colon cancer. We're having this fresh salad here with beans and onions and cilantro and corn and tomatoes, and it's really focusing on nutrient density, low sugar, low salt. Green bean casserole. This is something that you see at almost anybody's house during the holidays. It's got those French onion fried things on top. It's cream based, but it's not centered around the vegetable. You want to highlight the vegetable, not cover it up. If you were to look at this dish, it wouldn't even resemble a vegetable. It would just look like fried onion bits on top. We want to highlight the vegetable. Here we have some carrots and some asparagus covered in a basil pesto sauce. And last but not least, my favorite, cranberry sauce from a can. We're moving away from processed foods, canned goods, added sugars, and we're moving towards higher antioxidant, higher nutrient foods. And so this fresh made cranberry sauce on the right hand side is going to be much higher in nutrients and less sugar than the canned version. So I hope you found some value in attending this presentation. I thank you so much, and if you have any questions, you can head on over to SeanTheRD.com. There's a contact me page, and you can also check out the recommended resources, and there's also some how-to educational videos as well.